probably, I think everyone's in the same boat that in 2018, the substation fire was an eye-opener for all of us. It was the intensity and speed of that fire that I think made us all realize that this was a new kind of fire. And while we may have fought fire in this area for years, things had changed. Something had changed, and this fire really was a recognition of that. And so there were a lot of conversations that took place after that fire, and basically we were lucky in Gilliam County because we hadn't yet had our 2018 fire. And so the substation fire allowed us to really recognize that, yes, we better be prepared for wildfire, that this could happen at any time. And so a lot of spray rigs were put into action earlier than they might have been. And new spray rigs were created out of various flatbeds and tanks and things like that. And so by the time our turn to fight the fire rolled around, we were better prepared than we might have been. Let's just say that. And so our first fire, the first big fire, I believe, was Stubblefield, and that was a fire in Ferry Canyon. And that fire ultimately became two fires grown together and encompassing about 54,000 acres. And so a lot of people involved, of course, we have our emergency personnel, the fire district, road department, and landowner volunteers. And with the assistance of everyone who had pitched in, we were able to get that one more or less controlled for a period of time. So in the aftermath of that, a lot of conversations took place about fire, and there were two main recognitions that people agreed on, and that was the and we're a firefighting population. And so we felt like we've got to do things differently. We can't just keep fires the way we have decades, but resources have changed, and kinds of firefighting forces we have to do differently. And discussions focus on four main areas: equipment, communication, personnel, and navigation. And so we met with emergency personnel, department, and others who really started talking about this. So we had a meeting in the community who have an interest in wildfire, and we came up with the proposal text to a study area in Ferry Canyon to figure out how we could create more information available to people on a fire. So we developed a proposal to the Gilliam County Board requesting funding. We called it the Gilliam County Wildfire Project, and basically all of Ferry Canyon will include limestone and springs, water, and juniper canyons. The goal was to complete work in March 2015. That deadline has been high because the conservation district was grappling with resources and getting personnel available to actually do the project. So the other goals that we came up with in that discussion were that the best looking at predator growth canyons and landmarks. During the 2018 fire, we would talk to people who were outside of the area, and we would be giving them names of places that nothing to them because they weren't on anyone else's maps. And not just be local names, people given a canyon, for instance. The other thing we needed was mapping of tar poles and their level of protection, mapping of rural structures, and differentiating between ones that landowners wanted to save and ones that they did not save. We needed mapping of springs, wells, and any water resources that might be available out in the field for refilling wildfire sprayers. We needed mapping of established fire lines and the planning for vegetative fire breaks on ridge tops. We also talked about mapping of land cover, and Jacob alluded to that in his presentation. We needed to understand what kind of fuel loads we could expect out in the field when we're responding to a fire. And we're working on that aspect of it right now, basically trying to figure out how to convert the biomass production potential of a soil type and the fuel load that might be equivalent to. Of course, that will vary from year to year and with climate differences. We also talked about mapping topographic high points and coverage areas for optimal communication, and basically assisting fire districts with individual fire plans for landowners within the pilot area. Let's scroll on down here. We also talked about using unmanned aerial vehicles or drones to give us real-time logistical information during a fire. Because honestly, in Ferry Canyon, you can be on the rim trying to make decisions about how to respond to a fire that is over the horizon from you, that you have no visual contact with. And since we didn't have state aircraft or federal aircraft on the job to give us that view, we really talked about the need for being able to deploy a UAV to give us a perspective on a fire that was beyond our line of view. And that's something we'll work on this summer as well. So the fire boundary for the Stubblefield fire was created. We also looked at historic fires within that watershed and developed a mapping for that. The Conservation District decided that with the county funding, they would contract with Delaney Forestry Management to develop the Ferry Canyon study. And so we basically invited landowners and emergency services personnel to be involved in that process of identifying wildfire resources, including local names for canyons and landmarks, road layers for main roads, side roads, jeep trails, including the gradient of the road so that we could determine in advance what type of firefighting equipment could feasibly go down that particular road. And because a lot of these canyons are extremely rugged, so there's no way you're going to get a tanker down some of these areas. You could get maybe an ATV or other vehicles down into some of these areas, but we needed to know that in advance so that we weren't just sitting at the top waiting to decide, okay, is somebody going to try this and be the guinea pig? We wanted to know in advance whether it was feasible to take equipment down a particular road. The other thing we wanted is the location of water. And so tanks, ponds, we have irrigation canals, but there aren't really, we had that on the list, but there aren't really any around here. So along those lines, we had people identify not only household sources that could be used through a large spigot, but also ponds that might be on the property. I put in reservoirs for my livestock watering system, and so those reservoirs are now on the map and their capacity and what type of a connection is available, whether it's siphon or camlock or a hydrant. And then also gate types and condition, whether gates are locked or unlocked, whether they're barbed wire or metal. And so that oftentimes in responding to a wildfire, in the heat of the moment, we're cutting barbed wire, cutting fences, which becomes a headache for the landowner later. where if we had the information about where gates are, if it was feasible to use a gate, we would have that on a map and someone could identify where that gate was located and how wide it was and what kind of vehicles could get through the gate. The other thing is we decided on buildings that not every building on our property is worth saving. And so we wanted landowners to basically let us know which buildings do you want to save, which are your priority buildings, and which buildings are sacrificial buildings in a wildfire. And so we mapped those, and we had landowners come in and go through a paper map. We put red dots on the map indicating where these particular mapping resources were. And we have people come in and attach names to canyons, even canyons that are not named on topographic maps, and any other landmark feature. And we basically identified any secondary or primitive roads, and as well as water resources, gates, and buildings on the map. Then Delaney Forestry basically pulled that together into a geographic information system layer, and so we have a digital map of those resources. We're working on putting that into an app basically that can be opened up on a person's phone, and with the data set loaded onto their phone, they can access all of that information in the field without cell signal. And you know, most phones can still collect GPS location data, even though they may not have cell service. And so you should be able to indicate your position on the mapping software as you're in an area and trying to figure out where to go, what roads to use, where you can refill your tanks. As I mentioned earlier, the vegetation production or biomass production in an area, we're working on that aspect of it, and we'll eventually use that information to calculate theoretical fuel loads within an area. We can do that in several ways. One, with the historic fire map of Ferry Canyon, we have fires mapped from 2000 through 2017. And generally, when fire hits an area, we eliminate fuel load, depending on what vegetation succeeds what was burned. And so we have an idea in Ferry Canyon, for instance, what areas fuel load has not been eliminated. And the areas where it was eliminated maybe by a fire in 2000, but that fuel load may have reestablished itself through plant growth. And so we're just hoping to really get a handle on where the high-risk areas are in the canyon based on fuel load, where the areas are that we could establish fire breaks during a fire based on recent burns, and also where we need to put vegetative fire breaks or green fire lines in advance of a fire so that hopefully we can slow the progress of a fire. The substation fire opened our eyes about that potential and the fact that we have a lot of CRP in this county, and incidentally, most of that CRP that was up for expiration this date went back in. So we know that that fuel load is probably going to remain the same on that CRP acreage. So we need to really develop the information so that we understand when we respond to a fire what kind of fuel loads and land management are going on out there and what we can, possibly expect with a fire at a certain temperature and humidity and wind direction. And keep people safe that way is the main thrust of that. And also head off, runaways in terms of the fire. And, you know, sometimes you're not going to accomplish that, but if it's possible and you can judiciously decide where to put fire breaks, for instance, the road department with their graders, you know, we might be able to shorten the runs that a fire takes under extreme conditions. So the other thing we've done is down in the canyons, we mapped stream gradients, and you know, that basically just tells us that in the bottom of the canyon, where sometimes we end up fighting the fires, we can expect these kinds of conditions, and we might not be able to go up a side draw because the gradient of the stream in that draw tells us that it's too steep for most vehicles. It's kind of like, it's a similar approach to the road mapping and establishing a gradient or a slope of each road, is that having that gradient information for the tributaries to the main stream will tell you whether or not it's feasible to move equipment up into that particular part of the watershed. The vegetative fire breaks, we've looked at a number of locations for that, mostly on Seals property on the west side of the Ferry Canyon Watershed. So there are a lot of fires out on Seals, in fact, almost annually, and typically they're either lightning or boater started on the river. And with some well-located vegetative fire breaks, we might be able to make fighting those fires a little bit easier on ourselves. The other thing we've looked at is USDA has cost share programs for basically establishing livestock water or spring developments or whatever on farms and ranches throughout the state of Oregon. And we focus, of course, within Gilliam County. But one of the options we've looked at is USDA will evidently cost share 100% on what are basically livestock reservoirs, or that's what we would call them. And they would ideally go on the land of a livestock producer, but they also become a wildfire water resource. And some of these tanks are up to 10,000 gallons. And we're looking at a couple of locations in Ferry, remote locations where water's a long ways away. And we're working with the landowners on that to consider the construction of these large livestock water reservoirs in those locations, so that when we get all the way out to Rattlesnake Butte at the end of Seals property and there's no water out there, we could actually have a water reservoir out there to fill equipment from, which would make us a lot more effective and more efficient in fighting fire in those remote locations. So that's something that we're working on with the Conservation District and the Natural Resources Conservation Service.